Jakub Mackiewicz's Lost Time. Jakub Mackiewicz was born into a wealthy Polish-German family, and, in his spare moments, he continued to research the family tree, occasionally filling it out with fanciful new branches. In the best years, the family owned 5 large stone houses in Warsaw, 2 manors, and had bought up swathes of forest in Russia. A great part of their wealth was in Russian imperial bonds, which of course all evaporated in 1917. Back then, they'd been among the very best set. They had one of the few cars in the city, which they used to terrify horses. They donated money to philanthropic organizations and arts foundations. And their library was entirely leather-bound and full of rare editions. The throne of the living room was the imposing and glistening Steingräber and Schöne grand piano that Jakub's aunt learned to play in her youth. Later she was actually a pianist, and they bought her a Bechstein she even played in her 90s. They were a sizable family, and this aunt was truly one of the most remarkable members, on account of her ageless spirit. At 80 she began to study 2 more foreign languages, and she was a kind, considerate, one might even say obedient person, who was not at all bitter towards life in her heart. But all these once large and noble families decline eventually. One of that aunt's sons married a coarse and noisy agricultural student, a real harridan, who, to top it all off, already had an illegitimate child. Unheard of. This woman wore the pants in the house, thundered harshly over her quiet, docile husband, and ruled over everything. And that stepson, he stole some silver spoons from the house. "Thieves!" shouted the harridan, when she discovered the loss of this fine cutlery. The matter was given over to the constables, who immediately discovered the silverware in the nearest commission shop, and the embarrassing fact came out that the son had swiped it himself. This broke the Mackiewicz cousin's delicate spirit entirely. He came up a floor to Jakub's apartment with 2 bottles of vodka. A large part of the family had managed to hold on to their apartments in the same house. Somehow the inheritance had been divided into real estate for the sons and Russian imperial bonds, up the chimney, for the daughters. Ultimately, it made no difference. The state appropriated it all. All of them ended up destitute, although nobody came to take away the cupboards and the wardrobes. Much of the library was carried off, and it's believed that some academic commie got his paws on it, Professor Karolevsky or something. And so, the worthy family's decaying cousins sat with their noses behind liqueur glasses of unbelievably beautiful pink-white Bohemian crystal, decorated with gold, and they poured their vodka into carafes, because only slobs drink from the bottle. There was nothing to say. What happened, happened, and now they needed to find consolation, to somewhat extinguish the flame of bilious humiliation. The stepson had been brought up as their own, so much so that he didn't even know he didn't belong. How could he raise his hand against meaning and memories, against history? Both men seemed to have forgotten that in the years following the war, their whole family had survived by selling things from the house in piecemeal, be it a gold medallion or a telescope for stargazing. It went to the shop for pennies, because gold doesn't fill your stomach, does it? And nobody wanted to hire blue bloods, so it was hard to establish oneself in the new society at the beginning. And when they did finally get jobs, they were middling professional types, a bookkeeper at a sports paper, or a lab assistant at some institute. Good work for those who spoke 5 languages and were overall suspiciously educated. Jakub's binges usually ended when he sang, "We are the First Brigade," or "Poland is not yet lost," whereupon he grabbed a big butcher knife out of the kitchen cabinet and tried to storm out into the street to fight for the nation. When he had been forced back into his armchair by the people sharing the evening, big tears came into his eyes, and he announced mournfully, like Jesus, "You're going to turn me in. As soon as you can, you'll run off and give me up." He might snap the same to Eva, that she apparently did nothing but wait for the right moment when the winds of history would start to blow strongly again. Eva shrugged her shoulders. At the beginning, this idea was funny to her, but as time went on, the feeling became more pleasant and more just. "So say you," she muttered in her thoughts. Ultimately, if someone only ever expects ill of you, you might as well fulfill their hopes. It's nice to condemn everything done in the past. That way, a jealous man can badmouth another. but we certainly don't know what we would do if the times were for us as they were for them. So never ever judge, because every act to make the world a better place is always somehow painful, as it would be if it were to stay the way it is. Of course, an heir was a big thing for a man like Jakub, and after such a long wait, a son, what joy! That summer, when Eva did nothing but wash diapers and endure sleeplessness, they came to the country again, as usual, for the break and fresh air. The baby's food came from Eva's breast, water from the well, and wood from the forest. Does a chick worry what it eats or where it gets it from? It was the beginning of August. The crickets chirped deafeningly at the onset of dusk. The pink-white wild phloxes had an importunate saccharine smell, like unwashed babies' underclothes, and the black flies struck up dances around the garden lamps. The baby had finally fallen asleep, and Eva was sitting on the open porch, her hands resting on her outstretched belly as she watched the low, ominous full moon. At the same time, a mentally unbalanced 4 months pregnant young girl was lying in the general ward of the Warsaw Psychiatric Clinic. With only a year left of her school days, she worked for the city's garden association just near the school, where she planted pansies, phloxes, tuberous begonias, or marigolds according to the season. She'd found her own marigold at a party of the city's bohemians, a man with a black beard and burning eyes, exactly Jesus' age. It was a wild party, her head was foggy from the wine, and the girl was ensnared, and she does not herself remember what happened. Not passion, not struggle, but rather that, well, what happens, happens kind of apathy. And when Jesus' vicar on earth, he who loves fallen women most of all anyway, asked if she would let him in, she didn't understand the idiom. In fact, she had never seen this kind of erect tool before, to say nothing of the intricate art of tracking an ovulation cycle. She'd heard from somewhere that a hot bath was supposed to help if the time of the month doesn't want to come when it should, and for several nights this unhappy dope climbed into burning water that she had to heat on the stove because the sink didn't get that hot. But it was no use. As the days numbered on, the girl became dour, didn't go to work, and disappeared from home for a week. When she came back, they cursed her harshly, so she pushed a cabinet in front of her door so no one could get into her room, where she cried until she went blind. When her mother and grandmother finally forced their way in, the girl could see nothing. She shook in her bed and chittered nonsense words to herself, watching but not seeing the woman raging in front of her nose. And now the shrews jumped into a flurry of action. They took the girl to the doctor, who, after some consideration, diagnosed her with hysterical blindness, issued them a car with bars in it, and had the girl child brought to an asylum where, in only 2 days, her vision of the world returned to her, though in slightly darker colors. The doctor's hair was shining black, but her mouth was colored blood red. She wore several necklaces of gold, each one thicker than the next. Black hairs, natural, undyed, grew on her upper lip. Flashing under her white coat was the brightly colored edge of an expensive crimpline skirt. She had a tome of a notebook open in front of her, where she diligently scribbled down the case history. She dealt with all the paperwork patiently, without once lifting her eyes to the patient who had been called into the examination room. The patient, who had spent the whole sleepless night preparing to give a detailed account of her soul, was silenced with a few words. The doctor did not need her story, which was clear from looking anyway. Endogenetic depression, hysteria, and an undesired pregnancy. "Patients receive abortions in our hospital in any case," she consoled the depressed maid. "They are basically compulsory, barring any kind of very special circumstances." "Yes, it's taken you a bit past the cutoff, but not by much. That'll all get taken care of, and then we'll get you healthy again, too," the doctor graciously informed her. The girl, we'll call her Anka, was truly shell-shocked. She had barely begun to live, didn't know how life worked, what it even was, and now she was face to face with bringing on a new one while the people around her were attempting to treat this moral dilemma with a handful of bitter pills. In the old days, girls would have jumped into a pond. Now they were offered an avant-garde baby extrication service sanctioned by the state. 18 women had been stuffed together into Anka's ward. They were of different ages and had different problems, and, on the surface, nobody was too crazy. A bit weird, maybe. and they all puffed serious smoke in the front part of the bathroom. In the bed next to her lay a heap of matter with fuzzy edges, who ate fried chicken and meat pies nonstop, and who graciously offered her food to the girl as well. "You really have to eat for two now," she said, rustling the greasy papers. This woman only ever got out of bed at mealtimes. At home she had 2 school-age children and a worried husband left alone to manage all of the nonsense that had fallen around his neck. His wife was apparently a regular customer here at the center. She'd spent at least 4 or 5 months of the year in treatment, and had done so for a handful of years in a row. What exactly her problem was, aside from a wolf's appetite, Anka hadn't the slightest idea. In a cot by the window was a broody old bag with an angry eye and a dirty mouth. They told stories in the corner, and if Anka had heard these earlier, none of her misfortune would ever have taken place. Not a single good word about men could be heard there. They were considered to be breeding animals only. "When you've gotten rid of the baby, and you put yourself together here and there, you'll be quite a pretty thing. You could make a lot of money," the Queen of Spades considered, lustily. The ward was darkened after curfew. Only tiny lamps in the ceiling continued to glow. They called them the night lights. If you lay on your back in your bed and watched them, it would be as if you were watching a graveyard during a feast ceremony, where candles glimmer on headstones. Lying silently in her cot of iron, Anka suddenly feels that someone wants to climb into her bed, even if it's so narrow that surely only one person can fit into this correctional hole. Her neighbor has probably made a mistake coming back from the bathroom, and she all but crushes Anka with her wide body, presses so horribly that even though the girl thrashes with all her might, she doesn't have the strength to budge the heavy burden. The nightlights glimmer mildly. The headlights of night drivers wash over the room from the window, and Anka fights for her life in her bed. She can't breathe and can't shout, and from her throat comes only a plaintive whimper, like a dog hunting in a dream. She tries a final time to shove off the maniac pressing down on her chest. Suddenly she is free. Sitting up on her cot and covered in sweat, Anka looks around in confusion. The sick are asleep in their beds, lulled by the evening's bromide. Only pillowcases and bedsheet trims shine in the darkness of the ward. A body in the shape of a small hippopotamus is sleeping peacefully on the cot next to her. Her neighbor is in the right bed. What then was that? Anka is fully awake now. Night hag. The words come to her suddenly through fog. She had come to Anka from somewhere long ago because she scented a girl here. A river jumper. The night terror put Anka into action. She looked up the address of her black-haired spider, sent him a long, threatening letter, and though all letters arriving at the hospital were opened and reviewed by the staff, they gave her his response anyway. Jakub determined where they would meet, amid sand dunes and beach roses, about 1 kilometer away from his tired Eva and his Adam tadpole, who would be screaming about heartburn. The doctor gave Anka a searching look, pensively twisted the large gold diamond ring around her finger, and let her go. "You'll be back tonight, and you'll get into no trouble. Go then, and be a good girl," she said, after weighing the decision. The department was actually a free sort of place. They didn't set anyone on your tail. The other patients could also go around the city during the day, walk in the park, and cross the street to buy chickens and meat pies. And Anka went, hating more than anything in the world a woman she didn't know at all. Jakub's wife. This bitter feeling gnawed at her, gave her no peace, and yet it is completely incomprehensible where this jealousy came from, or why it came. Because there wasn't the slightest shred of love in her, least of all for the lanky shithead who had knocked her up. What on earth kind of agreement was she hoping for? She probably longed for somebody to give her the confidence to make the decision, because her own body was rebelling against the idea, and she did not want to lose the baby, at any cost. Her whole being had determined to give birth, and it was simply too difficult to break that impulse through reason. Anka quavered as she sat on the bus, and watched to make sure her stop didn't flit by. In her thoughts, she said her sentences one way, and then the other. How hard it was to put all those confused feelings into clear words. Jakub was similarly nervous. He took long steps as he paced back and forth by the shore, and mulled what were actually quite sinful thoughts. He wondered if he might not manage to take her again right here between the dunes. Those wide hips, those long slender legs, that sad languid neck. Kiss them, use them, forget them forever. "What will I do?" Anka asked in a sad, quiet voice, when they'd sat down between rocks on the beach. "On Wednesday, they sent 3 women from our wing for abortions, and I don't know how many more from the whole building. A whole bunch." "That is truly a great sin against God," Jakub observed piously, while his eyes flitted about, landing now on a seagrass brush, now on the horizon, unable to look the girl in the face. His hands fingered a straw pulled up from the ground restlessly. "How did you not know where babies come from? I'd have done it so it wouldn't have. But of course there's nothing to be afraid of any more," he added, hesitantly. "What do you mean, nothing to be afraid of? How will I tell my mother?" Anka was stricken. She had not, of course, understand the man's halfway hints. In the letter, at least, Jakub had said that he only lived with his wife out of duty, and because they'd had a child. But doesn't Anka now also have a child? Can she not also be an honest woman? And that other one, old, ancient, with a belly stretched out as if there was another baby left behind in there, with her fish eyes and the white bundle in her lap. Jakub had shown Anka a photo with all his relatives, aunts, uncles, and mothers, in a row in front of the same country house. In the very center was Jakub the beanpole himself, a proud father's happy smile on his face. "Yes, but I'm not going to leave Eva. You understand. We waited for the baby for so long. I might be able to visit you, help you in any way I can. But what you do now, you have to think over yourself. I do think you'll manage. This is a woman's job anyway. It's what God made them for." He cracked his long knuckles as he spoke, bent them backward one by one, and let them go with a pop. As if men's lives are somehow easier than women's. Who knows where these distraught, bone-headed pregnant girls rain down on your neck from? God help us. What should he have done, really? Throw away his life for some chick he barely knows? "You can't come visit me," Anka answered bitterly. "Not unless we sleep in the park. I can't ever bring you home. Not while you live. The old woman will eat you alive." In this she was fiercely correct. Anka's mother would regret until the hour of her death that she never pushed Jakub off a bridge, because she would have had a chance once. The man had manners, a good upbringing. He always stood up from his chair when a woman or someone older than himself entered the room. It was automatic, drilled in, and it also impressed Anka's mother. An educated man, from a worthy family. Maybe it isn't so bad if they mix blood. This half-festive dumbass stood next to Anka and looked at his second-born son. Polite, sure, but the smell of alcohol, the flowers, and the box full of cakes alone did not give him the courage to show himself to his family. "You are a devil! You've ruined her!" Mama cursed him with all her heart. The baby, of course, was a sweet, dear, innocent creature who knew how to grow up without a father. The family of warrior women take him into their care, the poor helpless babe. Even in her 7th month, when there was risk of miscarriage and Anka sat in a hospital for weeks, weaving a sweater as thin as a wisp and yellow like a chick, she didn't know whether it was a boy or a girl. A very serious doctor came to her room. Without much ceremony, she tried to convince the girl that she really still should, and would be able to, be rid of the child. The hospital would call it a miscarriage. Between her diagnosis and the papers from the asylum, the arguments in favor of the procedure were too strong. She was not at all ready to have a baby, and society doesn't need such mothers. Deranged schoolgirls! She's taken drugs? Those could be fatally dangerous to the child. And who knows how her mental state could suddenly deteriorate. Postpartum depression, for example, also strikes otherwise healthy women. "Sweetie, try to be reasonable," the doctor urged with mock piety. "It's very hard to live as a single mother. There's no time to study. You work bad jobs your entire life. Don't ruin your child's life." As if she knew exactly what kind of wombs happy and unhappy people come from. As if she knew everything. As if she, a doctor, had the right to intrude on God's plans, to correct and unbend them. To help a preemie twig into the world, nurse it to life, and then say to those whom men have left in the forest, "You'll just have to abort for medical reasons." And that doctor also has a thick gold chain around her neck. Just how stone-hearted can they be, these lovers of gold? Anka gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and, despite the fact that Jakub came to see them once or twice, gave him her name. "You don't want Eva to find out, do you?" she dropped, snidely. What use does a man have for a child that doesn't even carry his name? His visits became rarer, and his letters eventually ceased completely. Pan Mackiewicz had lost a world, and maybe no one would ever hear of Anka or her child ever again, because these kinds of things happen, and they're all always the same, and never at all interesting.